So when you think about Jekyll and Hyde, I want you to think about the idea of opposites. Um, People or things in collision. The first thing, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven, I'm going to say more about in a few minutes. Victor Frankenstein's quest for immortality, his story about trying to overcome the idea of death. This idea of one-sidedness, we'll talk about that, where one side believes that they're right and versus another side. It could be like the Palestinians or the Israelites or things like that. And we're going to talk about the concept of dark adaptation. We'll talk again about the interstitial relationship between opposites. One thing I like to talk a lot about is this idea of the inchoate ego, meaning the ego. All of our egos are always in the process of growing and maturing. But sometimes we get kind of stuck in habits or in everyday life, and we forget to grow. The quote from Ecclesiastics, a time to laugh and a time to cry, that everyone's familiar with, that every moment requires a specific thing. And if we become so wedded or so attached to one thing, we won't be available or willing to kind of entertain the other side. We won't say much about the transcendent function. Then there's the self archetypes, the idea of the individuation. And I listed a few things at the bottom. I want you to think about, when you're thinking about Jekyll and Hyde, think about it, the idea of addiction, the process of the stages of addiction, and how someone starts out feeling in control and how they slowly come under the guise of the substance that they're addicted to. We all know about red states and blue states, Democrat and Republicans. And it's interesting that we can't find a way somehow to meet in the middle, which in the middle I see as the healthy ego, the one that's able to listen to both sides of whatever's knocking at your door. Recently, you saw in the news, at least here in Chicago, the Chicago Public Schools and the Chicago Teachers Union, how they have so much difficulty coming together and negotiating. It's because they represent extremes and they go so far out of their way holding extreme positions. You might have read in the news recently, this woman named Neera Tandem. She had a nomination by President Biden to be the overseer of the Office of Management Budget, but she wasn't able to get through the confirmation process because she had made a lot of negative comments about several senators in the past. And now when she's coming in front of them, they wouldn't forgive her. So when we go out on the extremes, or when we make extreme statements, we upset the other side, and that'll play out in Jekyll and Hyde too, that we'll see shortly. Recently, you saw Governor Cuomo in New York. He's having some problems too. Representing his behavior as just, oh, I was just trying to be nice. And as you can see, the women that have been commenting on his behavior see it quite differently. So anyway, just to be thinking about what happens when oppositions are opposing one another without a strong sense of ego, strong sense of middle ground or healthy ego. A couple quotes that I like to go to. I come across this one by Du Bois from 1905. He says, "Herein lies the tragedy of the age. Not that men are poor, all men know something of poverty. Not that men are wicked, who is good? Not that men are ignorant, what is the truth? Nay, what really is the tragedy, that men know so little of men." So why would that be? If you think about it, why would we know so little about each other? Or as we analysts and we therapists know when we're dealing with people, why do we know so little about ourselves? The second quote is by a writer from, actually he was writing back in the early 1900s. And this comes from the book, The Golem. And he says, "The whole of life is nothing more than questions that have taken unto themselves shape and bear within themselves the sum of their own answer, and answers that are pregnant with more questions. Only fools see it otherwise." So life is an ongoing kind of idea that what we know today may change tomorrow. But most of us, most egos like to kind of like feel like they've arrived and they know it. And they're not really interested in opening themselves up. So we become kind of closed down to new material. So just keep that in mind in the background. All right, if I can go forward. All right, when you think of Jekyll and Hyde, I think if you see all of the depictions, you watch all of the different movies about Jekyll and Hyde, it seems to be, people seem to think it's about evil. Well, it actually is about evil because it's about the evil archetype. And we'll get into that more and more as we go. But you know, what is evil? Why are we so fascinated with evil? And I want to ask a question of the audience. And if anybody can answer this question at the end, maybe I'll send you a Chicago pizza or something like that. But in all of these stories, all the movies get it right, but the book gets it wrong. And I want you to think about it as you're thinking about the story of Jekyll and Hyde, like when you read fairy tales, there's something missing. There's an element missing in the story. And I want to know if you can figure out what it is. What is actually missing? And it to some of you, maybe it'll become obvious as we go. One of the favorite quotes that I've come across when I was in my first analysis, when I was in training, is this idea that came from this guy, Terence. He was a philosopher in Rome in 50 BC. And he said something, nothing human is foreign to me. And it's like, I've often been intrigued by the idea that when people do bad things, people say, I don't understand that. Like they must be from another planet or whatever it is. And that kind of harkens back to that quote about men know so little of men. It's like we hide, or we try to avoid and stay away from shadow. And like this guy was saying, we need to like understand ourselves both in light and darkness, and to know that all of these things make up what it means to be a human being. That, as you know, we have light and we have shadow. We're not just one or the other. This is a nice picture of Lucifer. This is what I refer to as when I'm trying to think of the idea of consciousness or splits. To me, if I go back into history or into literature, the first split seems to have occurred in heaven. It's like that goes back to the quote that we'll come to shortly in Milton's book, Progress. What is it called? What is it? Paradise Lost. So why is it that Lucifer doesn't get along with God? I just found it really interesting. Why does he get kicked out? So let's go to the next slide. And here's, him falling from heaven, and he's going down to what we call hell. And so Lucifer says, when he gets there, he says, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. So why is that? Why does Lucifer say it's better to serve in hell or to rule in hell than to serve in heaven? Because we don't like to be told, what we can do. We want to we want to be the captain of our own boat. And so why is it that in heaven, and I don't know the answer to this, why is it that there has to be a top god or someone that's in charge that tells other people or other angels or whatever what to do? But Lucifer is the first one who upsets the apple cart. He decides that he's not going to go along with that. He's going to rebel, and of course he gets thrown out. But you can see the angels barring his way back in, and he has to go down to hell.